images coming out of Israel and Gaza this week have been horrifying. Scenes of Israeli police firing stun grenades and tear gas at Palestinian protesters inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, followed by rockets fired by Hamas raining down on Israeli cities, buildings collapsing in Gaza after being hit by Israeli airstrikes, and now mob violence on city streets. It's the worst fighting between Israel and the Palestinians in the occupied territories since 2014. And right now, it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. What we're seeing is the culmination of tensions that have been brewing for weeks. There's been anger growing over a campaign to push Palestinian families out of their homes, protesters facing off with Israeli police over their right to assemble, and then outrage over a planned right-wing nationalist march, all happening within the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Today, we're going to talk about how all of these things came together and resulted in the chaos that we're seeing right now. We've been here before, many times. So what makes this time different? I called up Mark MacKinnon in London to try and get an answer. He's our senior international correspondent at The Globe and the former Middle East bureau chief. You're listening to The Decibel from The Globe and Mail. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Let's get into it. Mark, hello. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
How long have you covered Israel and Palestine as a reporter?
I was thinking about this just the other day, actually. My first trip was almost 20 years ago. I flew to the Middle East in the wake of the September 11th attacks in the United States. Feels a long lifetime ago. I ended up living later for 4 years in Jerusalem, and that was a really interesting experience. I lived in a house that was literally on the Green Line from 1967, what used to be the border between Israel and Jordan. So our neighbors to the right, my back was to the front door, were Israelis, and to the left were Palestinians. So really got to understand the complexities of the story and saw neighbors get their homes demolished, and also lived the Israeli experience of hearing sirens because there's incoming Hamas rockets.
We're speaking on Thursday morning here in Canada. It's afternoon where you are in London, but the day's almost done in Jerusalem. And I wonder, can you give me a sense of what's happening there right now?
The latest death toll, which is what gets a lot of the headlines in Gaza, now is up to 83 people dead, and Israel is continuing its airstrikes. Hamas is continuing to fire rockets. I think the last count that I saw was 1,300 rockets in the last 48 hours had flown from Gaza into Israel, and that at least 7 Israelis had been killed in that exchange. Mm-hmm. The big news today is that Israel looks like it's preparing for a ground invasion of Gaza. But also, something new that's happening in other parts of Israel is in Arab Israeli communities. You're seeing a lot of violence right now between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, and that is deeply worrying for peace inside the country, not just between Israel and its neighbors.
There's a lot of history here, but how far back do you think we have to go to understand the most recent spike in violence?
Well, to do the history of this properly, I mean, you can pick a whole bunch of spots in history, but to understand where we're at right now, it starts in 1967 and the Six-Day War, at which Israel was attacked by its neighbors. And Israel ended up, after that conflict, in possession of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. That was 54 years ago. And so now you've had entire generations of Palestinians and their children, now grandchildren, growing up under Israeli military occupation. I mean, that's an entirely separate discussion. But I mean, if you can imagine generations of people growing up with the frustration of having to ask a foreign soldier, a foreign army, for permission to travel to the next town or to go to another country, or whether you can build on land that your family owns. And of course, through that whole time, it's important to say, Israel's never felt secure in its borders.
I know tensions were also running high over Palestinians being evicted from this neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheik Jarrah, and that a court ruling was supposed to come down on Monday. Can you tell me, just very briefly, the history of that and what that court ruling was about?
So the history of that particular piece of land goes back to pre-1948, before the founding of the State of Israel. And the piece of land in question was owned by Jews pre-1948. What happened in the 1948 war is people from both sides fled fighting. And so you had the Jews who lived in Sheik Jarrah fleeing into what is now Israel, and you had Palestinians from other parts of what is now Israel fleeing to what is now East Jerusalem. In the intervening period between 1948 and 1967, the Jordanian government gave that land to the Palestinian families who live there now. What this court case is about is the Jewish families that owned that land sold it onwards to groups that would like to increase Jewish settlement of East Jerusalem. They're saying, we are now the legal owners of this land and you have to leave it. Palestinians are saying, we were given this land by the legal government of the day. And this has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. But the reason why Palestinians were upset is they know they're not going to win this argument. The law specifically provides for absentee property is available to be purchased by Jews, but not by Arabs. And this happens all across East Jerusalem. And Palestinians, I think, drew a line around these 6 families, decided this was a cause they wanted to take up on the international stage. And then there was this separate thing happening, which was during Ramadan, Israeli police started restricting access to something called the Damascus Gate. And the Damascus Gate is the main thoroughfare connecting Arab East Jerusalem with the Muslim quarter of the Old City. And the Old City, of course, where all the holy sites are.
Tensions boiling over in Jerusalem after more than a week of nightly clashes. Hundreds of Palestinians protested the closing of a space in front of the Damascus Gate, while Jewish extremists marched elsewhere, shouting death to Arabs.
These two events added together, then you had something called Jerusalem Day, which was Monday, where you had every year nationalist Israelis march through the city celebrating what they see as the reunification of Jerusalem. This march always ends at the Western Wall, which is the holiest site in Judaism, but it's also adjacent to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And some Palestinians became concerned that the mosque could become a target. They gathered in the mosque. They had rocks with them. They feared there would be violence there, and they refused to leave when the Israeli police asked them to leave.
It seems like this all sort of came to a head on Monday. The court ruling was supposed to come down. This Jerusalem Day march was planned. So things were really tense. And this is when Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque and hundreds of Palestinians were injured. 21 Israeli police officers were injured. What actually happened there? Why did they storm the mosque?
Well, this is where we get into a situation where it's every video I've seen starts from a certain point, right? So what happened there? We know for certain that this court case was postponed because the Israeli government became concerned about everything being piled onto Monday. We had this march coming. We had the Palestinians who went to pray in the mosque, deciding they wanted to defend the mosque against what they saw as a potentially aggressive march. And the Israeli police decided to move in and to clear the mosque. Later, they rerouted the march, but this all happens before they reroute the march. So before they get into the mosque, they're confronted with stone-throwing Palestinians in the compound. There's an open-air courtyard in front of the mosque itself. And that's where the main confrontations happen. But what creates the conflict, or what widens the conflict, is when the Israeli police go into the mosque. And in this era, there's smartphones filming everything. And you have these scenes of people who are not throwing stones, people who are just praying or hiding inside the mosque from what's happening outside. And there's a lot of shouting, there's flash grenades, there's tear gas. And it, as someone put on the social media the other day, when try and imagine this happening inside the Vatican and what the response would be.
So after this, Hamas starts firing rockets from Gaza.
Yes, and before Hamas fired its rockets, I was speaking to Israeli and Palestinian analysts who agreed that it was likely that this incident, at that point, it was just some stone throwing inside the mosque and some videos of Israeli police firing tear gas into the mosque. It was all appalling. No one liked what was happening. But because the march had been rerouted, because the court case had been postponed, everyone thought, okay, we're going to go back to normal, tense normal, for a while now. But then Hamas fires its rockets and off we go in a different direction.
What efforts have been made to try and de-escalate this rise in violence?
Frankly, not very much. And if you look at the statements from governments like Canada's and the United States, they all begin by saying we support Israel's right to self-defense, which is a way of, it's not quite saying keep going, but you're not asking for a halt in the violence when you use that wording. The United States is sending its diplomat responsible for the Middle East on an urgent mission to try and speak to both sides. So is the United Nations. When the U.S. sends, or when Canada makes any diplomatic effort there, though, they don't speak to Hamas. So there's only so much that can be accomplished if you're only talking to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and to the Israeli government. The Egyptians have often in the past played a very useful intermediary role because they will go into Gaza, they'll speak with the powers that be on the ground, and they also have an embassy in Tel Aviv. They went in yesterday, tried to negotiate a ceasefire, and they failed.
And What are both sides saying about the possibility of a ceasefire?
Well, Hamas has signaled that it's willing to have a ceasefire now. I think because they have made their statement. I mean, they made it clear that you don't touch the Al-Aqsa Mosque without a response. They have shown some increased military capability with the number of rockets they've been able to fire into Israel. They've overwhelmed Israel's vaunted Iron Dome defense system in a few places. We've seen rocket strikes on Tel Aviv. Both airports in Israel are currently closed because of the fear of rocket fire. From an Israeli perspective, though, for those reasons, there's not going to be a ceasefire right now. They have not delivered their message to Hamas yet. They haven't dismantled Hamas's new military capability. I understand the Israelis have said they wouldn't consider a ceasefire before Saturday. That's very unlikely to happen because Saturday is what the Palestinians call Nakba Day, which is the marking of what they call the catastrophe, the founding of Israel, the loss of many Arab homes in what is now Israel. So there's no way that any Palestinian leader will accept a ceasefire that begins on Saturday. So there's a lot of signaling right now. But if you watch what's happening, the build-up around Gaza, there's a lot of signs suggesting that this will escalate before it calms.
I kind of want to give people an idea of what we mean when we say Israeli airstrikes versus rockets from Hamas, because you hear a lot about this back and forth in the last few days and, the number of rockets that Hamas has been firing. But I've also heard about how unsophisticated these rockets have been and kind of how little impact they have compared to the airstrikes being launched by Israel. And the casualties right now kind of seem to suggest that, right?
Yes, Hamas is showing a military capability that it didn't have before. That's just in the sheer number of rockets launched and their range, but you're absolutely correct. These are mostly fairly crude rockets. They've gotten better at targeting, as we can see by the fact that Ben Gurion Airport was forced to close, that these rockets are hitting the cities they say they're going to hit. But where in that city that lands, I don't think Hamas is a very good idea, especially when you're firing, knowing there's an airstrike coming on the spot that you've just shot from very quickly. So yes, we've got 7 Israelis dead, and that is, obviously deeply traumatic and will just increase the anger on the Israeli side. But Israel's ability to take out, as we've seen in the last few days, entire apartment blocks, just to lay waste to Gaza City. 83 people are dead, at least. And obviously none of us would want to live in a place where a militia was capable of hitting you with rockets. But, when it comes down to the militaries, this is anything but a fair fight, which is why this only ends when Israel decides it's time to end.
I just want to talk about Benjamin Netanyahu for a second. He's in a precarious situation politically right now. He's under investigation for fraud. He failed to form a coalition government during the last election in March, which kind of created this opportunity for the opposition to take over. And right now, he's not really trying to calm things down. He's been praising Israeli forces for taking a strong stand and talking about how this is like a struggle for the heart of Jerusalem.
A struggle is taking place in the heart of Jerusalem. This is not a new struggle. This is a struggle between intolerance and tolerance, between law-breaking and violence and law and order. The struggle is
what is the political calculation that he's making, do you think?
That's a really important question. And as you alluded, there was an election in March. Mr. Netanyahu won the largest block of seats, or his Likud party did. And they had 28 days after the election to try and form a government. They failed. 8 days ago, and this is probably very important if you're looking at how the tensions began, the president of Israel asked the opposition, led by a centrist politician named Yair Lapid, to try and form a government. He has been trying to form what would be a unity government of people on the right wing of Israeli politics who are opposed to Mr. Netanyahu, with people on the left, which would even include Arab Israeli parties. It's very difficult right now to see how that could possibly happen. And as you said, Mr. Netanyahu now gets to look like a war leader. He's very used to this role. Israelis are used to him in this role. And it's quite possible that the right-wingers who were opposed to Mr. Netanyahu continuing as prime minister may now see a national interest in supporting him to carry on in this job, which, as you mentioned, he is facing 3 corruption trials. And the best way for him to protect himself legally is to remain in the prime minister's chair.
And where is Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, in all of this?
Well, he's in Ramallah, that much we know. But, he was on television last night speaking, and it was really hard to see how he's relevant to what's happening right now. Palestinian Authority, of course, was formed by the Oslo Peace Accords of the 1990s, but it was supposed to be an interim institution that would oversee the eventual creation of a Palestinian state. And that seems very far away right now. So he has limited self-government in the West Bank, but these clashes are happening in East Jerusalem, in Arab-Israeli cities, neither of which Mr. Abbas can visit, let alone exercise influence over. And the Gaza Strip, which has for the last 15 years been out of the control of Mr. Abbas and his Fatah movement, that the Islamist militia Hamas controls that area. So what he can do is very, very unclear.
Mark, with everything we're seeing right now in Jerusalem and Gaza and inside Israel, where do you think all of this is going?
I think where this is going right now is some kind of Israeli incursion on land into the Gaza Strip to dismantle the Hamas network. They've done that before. It usually buys them some time. There's a casualty count, at which point Israelis want the conflict to end. Right now, there's a lot of anger, the desire to see Hamas punished. What's different this time is that you've got these outbreaks of violence now between Israeli citizens, Arab and Israeli citizens. And so that has to affect, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, the usual calculus of, I think I can crush Hamas for a while, is now blended with, well, what does that do in cities like Lod and cities like Jaffa and cities like Haifa? And how do we police all that? What does that do to Israel's reputation on the international stage? There's a very controversial report that just came out from Human Rights Watch, where they claimed that Israel was committing the crime of apartheid in its treatment of the Palestinians. A lot of people ignored that report, thought it was hyperbole, but when you see what's happening, when you see sort of the uprising of Arab Israelis as well, you start to see that there is a feeling, even among Israeli citizens who are of Arab descent, there's a feeling that they are not treated fairly, that there are two systems. That's the worst case scenario from an Israeli point of view, is that this is going to become a broader Arab-Israeli issue rather than an Israel-Gaza issue.
And why is this happening now? Why are Arab Israelis rising up?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I would suggest, and because of COVID, I haven't been able to travel to Israel for the last year, so I'm thinking of previous visits there and previous conversations. But a couple of things have changed. Probably the most significant one is that over the 12 years that Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power, he has courted a rising far right in Israeli politics, and they've become more emboldened. Some of the marches that we've seen videos of recently with people marching around with the Israeli flag yelling death to Arabs, that never happened when I was living there. That was not within the spectrum of acceptable political expression when I was there 10, 12 years ago. Nowadays, I saw many, many videos like this. And the right can sometimes, you read the statements of Israeli politicians, including the president of Israel, a theoretically neutral politician who posted on Twitter yesterday that he saw bloodthirsty Arab mobs, is how he described the behavior of his own citizens. They see a racist, an increasingly racist government. And so they feel like they have lost the Israel that existed 20 years ago when people like Ehud Barak were in power is very different from the Israel that exists now in terms of domestic politics.
So it seems to me like, talking about Israel and Palestine has always felt kind of taboo. And I don't know if this is just my bubble, but it feels like a lot more people are talking about Palestinian human rights on social media. Lots of celebrities have been speaking out in the last few days. I wonder, have you noticed a difference in how this conflict is being talked about here in the West?
I think there's a growing gap between how, the popular conversation and the political conversation. I agree that if you look on social media, there's a lot more people, a lot more outlets that are able to put their point of view out there. And I think that has led to sort of, a change in the conversation. People like Trevor Noah, like Malala, have made some very statements that some will consider provocative, but which you might not have heard 20 years ago in the last Palestinian uprising.
Israel versus Palestine. And I know that even saying that sentence means I'm losing followers online and I'm on the verge of being blocked on all social media and in life. That's how contentious this topic is. I mean, before you even finish the sentence, people are like, "You idiot, how dare you, shut the hell up." But guys, we have to talk about it. because this is one of the most difficult stories that has existed in our lifetime.
That said, if you look at the statements from the Trudeau government, from the Biden government, the language isn't very different than it has been before. Mm-hmm. And the aforementioned report by Human Rights Watch, and I feel compelled to raise this, they gave this report to ourselves and to the CBC. We both had advanced copies of this. The Globe and Mail published this report. CBC decided that this statement, even though it's coming from a very respected human rights organization, international human rights organization, that has direct impact on Canadian foreign policy. This is a country that we have a very good relationship with, and Human Rights Watch was suggesting that we should reconsider that relationship because Israel was guilty in their estimation of the crime of apartheid. The CBC didn't run the story. So, we still have a media and governments that treat it with this great sensitivity, like there's some things you can't, there is still a taboo. And boy, am I going to get emails for even talking about this. But yeah, the taboo exists, but it's being broken down on social media because different people are expressing themselves.
Yeah. I wonder, what kind of context do you think people might be missing if they haven't been there?
The overall context that I, have to remind myself of is that you have two deeply traumatized peoples. Israel was founded by people fleeing the Holocaust, and their descendants are descendants of survivors of the Holocaust or people whose parents didn't survive the Holocaust. And their sense of insecurity, their sense that Israel is the only place they're safe, is really, really hard for anyone who doesn't spend a lot of time there to understand. And then there's the Palestinian dispossession, depending on which Palestinians you're speaking about. Some will say 70 years, some will say 50 years. They lost their homes. The number of Palestinians I've met who still have the keys to this home that their family hasn't been to for 50 years. That is so strong in the Palestinian narrative. But these two narratives don't understand each other. There's no way to cross them over. It's very rare to find the Palestinian who lost their homes but really understands the Holocaust, or the Jewish Israeli who moved into this new land, this safe place, and has deep sympathy for the person who was pushed out. It's a deeply traumatized part of the world. And when you live there, you learn to try and start each article from remembering that point.
Mark, thank you so much for helping me make sense of this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Mark MacKinnon. You can follow him on Twitter at Mark MacKinnon and find his writing at theglobeandmail.com. Before I let you go, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you want us to cover next, or just say what's up. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. And most importantly, wherever you listen to podcasts, follow us. This is the last episode of our first week. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great weekend, and I will talk to you on Monday.